once everybody's finished them. Okay? Matthew, I saw him, right? Corey. Okay, so chapter 5 is the cardiovascular system, chapter 6 is the respiratory system. Those will be the two next pieces of information for the next exam. Okay, so I'm trying to keep these blocks of info relatively small to give you better studying chances, okay? And again, with both of these systems, the structure should be reviewed from AMP. So I don't intend to spend a lot of time talking about structure other than where it directly impacts the kinds of adaptations that we see when we exercise. All right? So if I'm going too fast on that structure stuff, you need to go back and make sure that you have a really good picture of that in your head so that you can follow what's going on when we exercise and what adaptations are happening. All right. So, AMP. Cardiac cycle and how it's controlled, has some adaptations, so we'll be looking at this. Cardiac output, blood pressure, oxygen delivery. Okay. So that should look familiar, hopefully. Make sure that you know your terminology for the pulmonary circulation and the peripheral circulation so that you're not getting those two separate circulations muddled up, all right? So what's happening with the circulation to the lungs and back to the heart, what's happening to the circulation to the rest of the body and back to the heart, all right? And the structure, okay? So our structure is important because we've got to know the flow, right? I'm coming in to the right atrium, I'm going down to the right ventricle, I'm coming out to the lungs, I'm coming back from the lungs into the left side of the heart, and the left ventricle is responsible for moving the blood out around the body. Okay. So that's important because what we see happens is based upon that circulation. Anybody completely lost? All right. Okay, so this should be looking familiar, this kind of diagram. And these diagrams are showing, rather inside the structure, what's the blood supply to the heart? So the heart's full of blood all the time, but the heart does not use oxygen and nutrients from the blood that is inside the heart. All right, that is purely mechanical. It's coming in, it's going, getting oxygen, it's coming back, it's getting sent around the body. It does not feed the heart. So the heart is a muscle. It's not quite the same as my skeletal muscle, but it's still a muscle, and it needs oxygen and nutrients. So it has its own blood supply that wraps around the outside of the heart so that when the heart constricts, the blood supply doesn't get cut off. Right? So that's pretty sensible. The blood supply doesn't run through the muscle tissue. Right? It wraps around the outside of the heart so that as the heart is beating, that blood flow is still providing what the heart needs. Okay. And where am I? Here's my main coronary artery. Okay. And that one's really crucial. We've got one on the left, we've got a left coronary artery and a right coronary artery, but we have this main. And everything is dependent on how healthy, like how well your heart is going to work, depends on how good the oxygen and nutrition supply is. So when we're looking at cardiovascular diseases, one of the problems that we see is that these veins and arteries can't do their job properly because they're clogged, right? They're blocked in some way. The blood pressure in the system, when we're looking at blood pressures, is at its highest in the aortic arch. Okay. So that's the point at which the blood is being pumped by the left ventricle out around the body. So the blood pressure in the aortic arch is very high. That's going to play a big role when we're looking at blood flow. Probably, hopefully Wednesday we'll look at blood flow. All right, so cardiac cycle then, what's the pattern of contraction that we see in the heart? Okay. And the other day we measured blood pressure in lab, and I said that the high number that you get when we measure blood pressure is the pressure during contraction of the heart, systole. So that high number, that 120-ish, is systolic blood pressure. And the lower number that we measure is the blood pressure during the relaxation phase, and that's diastole. So diastolic blood pressure is the lower number, the 80-ish. Okay? So, heart contracts. The blood is ejected out of the chamber. When the heart relaxes, then the chamber can fill back up again with blood. When you're sitting here, right, you're not sitting here thinking, okay, I have to contract my heart, I have to relax my heart, I have to contract my heart. Right? It's not voluntary muscle contraction, it's involuntary. So how do we control that? Because if I'm not in control of it, then how come I can change it by training? Right? I don't make it slow down, it slows down if I do the right kind of training. So what's the mechanism that drives the control? And we have two different, and we umbrella them as intrinsic or extrinsic control. So the intrinsic control of my heartbeat is initiated by a special clump of cells that sit on the back wall of the right atrium, called the sinoatrial node. Okay? And very often, you're going to see that just as the SA node. Sinoatrial, right? If sinoatrial is confusing, SA node. Okay? I'm fine with SA node because if you forget what the SA stands for, you can go look it up. Right? If you forget that completely, now we've got a problem because it's important. Right? So remember it whichever way you find the easiest, the proper name or the acronym. SA node then is also called the pacemaker for your heart. So it acts as a pacemaker, so you might know people who've had a pacemaker added to their heart. That often occurs if the SA node stops working correctly. Right? We're clever enough, we know enough about how this works, that we can add a fake pacemaker to someone's heart now. Right? And the SA node initiates heart contraction at a rate of, on average, 100 beats per minute. Right? So my internal pacemaker sets my heart rate at 100 beats per minute. It initiates a contraction. It initiates an electrical signal, just like we talked about last week, that we see in the nerve. Okay. I have an electrical signal that flows across the surface of the muscle, causing the contraction, and as it comes across the surface of the atrium, it hits another clump of specialized cells called the atrioventricular node, the AV node. And the AV node plays a really crucial role because it hangs on to the electrical impulse for just a minute amount of time. Somewhere around the 10th of a second. And then it sends the signal on across the ventricles and down the Purkinje fibers so that we get contraction across the rest of the heart. All right? Now that may not seem like a very important job, but if I have two chambers and they both contract at the same time, where's the blood from the top chamber going to go? Right? Because the bottom chamber is shut now. Okay? So this AV node plays a really massive role because it means that what I get, if you actually watch, and I'm sure if you go online you can see film of this, but if you watch a heartbeat, what you see is gudum, gudum. Right? The whole thing doesn't contract at one time. The atria contract while the ventricles are relaxed. That means the blood that is coming out of the atria can fill up the ventricle, and then the ventricle can squeeze and send the blood wherever it's got to go, either to the lungs or to the body. Without the AV node hanging on to that impulse for that minute amount of time, both of them will contract at the same time, and now I don't have blood flow. Okay? So it plays a really important role. And then the Purkinje fibers run through the tissue of the ventricles, and they are just, they can conduct the signal faster than the muscle tissue. Okay? So the heart is quite large. Right? If I was trying to if I'm trying to send this electrical signal all the way across the heart, then the bottom end of the heart would be contracting quite a lot later than the top half of the ventricle. So the Purkinje fibers speed up that transmission of the signal so that we see relatively even contraction of the ventricle, right? The bottom end contracts a little bit later than the top end, but not as much as if the signal had to go across the muscle the whole way. Okay. So it's a really clever setup to allow this to do such an effective job at moving the blood to the lungs or moving the blood out to the body. So, sinoatrial node is my pacemaker. It initiates autorhythmicity, so we have this internal heartbeat, right? If nothing else was going on, your resting heart rate would be 100 beats per minute, because this is in charge. Okay. Clearly that's not the case. Right? We're not all sitting there going, because our heart rate's like bursting out of our chest. So there has to be something else going on that plays into the picture. And what we have is our other lump, our extrinsic control. So our intrinsic control is sinoatrial node, AV node, Purkinje fibers. Our extrinsic control has to do with the nervous system that we talked about last week. Right? So in addition to my pacemaker, I've also got the parasympathetic nervous system, can impact the heart and decrease my heart rate. Okay, so my parasympathetic, my rest digest system, I need to slow the heck down. Don't need to be spending this much energy. I need to be concentrating on digestion. I don't need my heart going crazy, sending out blood to my muscles, because I need the blood to go to my stomach so that I can utilize this food. The sympathetic nervous system, remember, is our fight or flight system. So the sympathetic nervous system can talk to the heart and go, oh no, 100 beats per minute, that's not fast enough, ramp it up. We've got to get tons of oxygen to these muscles so we can get away from the tiger. Right? So I have to be able to speed my heart up or slow my heart down from the pacemaker. The pacemaker is just the foundation. Right? It means that my brain does not have to concentrate on initiating every single beat. My brain has to concentrate on controlling the heartbeat dependent upon what my current activity level is. Right? So then, most of the time, whatever heart rate we're measuring is a balance between these two types of extrinsic control. Usually the parasympathetic nervous system is dominant. Right? Most of the time, my heart rate is less than 100 beats per minute. So when I'm asleep, when I'm eating, when you're sitting in class, when you're driving your car, the parasympathetic nervous system is dominant and playing the biggest role in just tamping down how much work your heart is doing. If you need to, the sympathetic nervous system can kick in. We turn down the parasympathetic system, we turn up the sympathetic signal, and we can speed up heart rate so that we can increase oxygen delivery and increase nutrient delivery to the heart. Can you put it away, please? Put it away. All right? So, which one at any time is playing the dominant role? That's what you want to be concentrating on. Okay? At the start of exercise, it's quite interesting because actually what we see first, when I start to see my heart rate go up, so if my 100 beats per minute is my baseline, okay, lower than 100 beats per minute means my parasympathetic is on. Okay. Higher than 100 beats per minute means my sympathetic is dominant. So from rest then, when you first start to move and your heart rate is very responsive, it's like blood pressure, very responsive, it will change very, very quickly. Even if it only goes up 5 beats per minute, between you standing here and you walking out of the arena, your heart rate will be higher. Right? The first thing that happens then when we start exercising is not that we turn on the sympathetic, we turn down our parasympathetic, and so our heart rate starts going up to the baseline. And then if we need to, because we're exercising deliberately, or we're riding our bike, we're running, we're down in the gym training, then I can turn on this one and we get, right? If any of you measure your heart rate regularly, you probably see heart rates of 150, 160, 170 at your age, right? What's your training heart rate when you're training hard? That's going to be your sympathetic system. And then when we try to bring it back down, we have to switch this one off, turn this one up, because now we're up here, right? And I have to bring it back down again. When we train, we induce bradycardia, which is slow heart rate, deliberately. Right? What I would like is my resting heart rate to be 50, 55 beats per minute. Right? Well, technically, bradycardia is anything less than 60 beats per minute. So clinically, less than 60 beats per minute would indicate that there was a problem, unless you're an athlete. And then 60 beats per minute can indicate that you're very, very fit. So it's a little bit like we talked about a little bit in lab with that blood pressure. Those really high blood pressures are bad, but if you just came out of the gym, your blood pressure would be high because you've just been lifting in the gym and it takes a while to go back down. That wouldn't be diagnosed as clinically high blood pressure. So 60 beats per minute isn't necessary. It may be pathological, or it may be an indicator of someone being very healthy. Right? Armstrong, cyclist chap, his resting heart rate, he's a freak. I mean, even without the cheating, he's a freak. Right? The man's a freak. His resting heart rate is something like 35, 38 beats per minute. It's very bizarre. Most people, even if they train hard, can't get their heart rate that low. I mean, he is just unusual. Right? But that gave him a very big advantage when you're looking at an aerobic performance, because his heart rate is so slow in the first place. He doesn't have to work that hard to be running or cycling very fast. So it gave him a big advantage physiologically over a lot of other people. So the signal comes from the AV node and is transmitted across the surface of the ventricle and via the Purkinje fibers. and we see reasonably simultaneous contraction across the whole ventricle because of the way the muscle is made. It's not like skeletal muscle. All right? It's not one long, big, long fiber. It's lots of little fibers with discs in between each fiber that can transmit the electrical signal. So the whole structure of heart muscle is different to skeletal muscle. The left ventricle then, when you look at the heart, the left ventricle has thicker wall than the right ventricle. Okay. Because of the job the left ventricle does, and that's why you have to know that pattern of blood flow. Because the right ventricle is responsible for sending blood to the lungs, which are right here. Okay, so the right ventricle doesn't have to do very much work to achieve its job, because it's just got to squirt the blood hard enough to come out through the pulmonary veins and get to the lungs. The left ventricle has to contract hard enough to squirt blood all the way down to my little toe, otherwise my little toe is going to fall off. So now my heart, my left side of my heart has to work really hard to get blood all the way through the rest of the body. So it works way, way harder. Well, if I'm down in the gym and I have a 1 pound weight in this arm and I have a 10 pound weight in this arm, what do I expect to see happen? What's going to happen?
7 and 10 pound weight is stronger.
Bigger, stronger, right? This arm is going to be bigger and stronger than this arm. Isn't that what you would expect if you were down in the gym? Okay. If I work harder with one arm, that arm's bigger and stronger. It's exactly the same in the heart. You just have to work out which side of the heart is doing the most amount of work. So when we exercise, the left side then is doing even more work than it is at rest. And already at rest, it's working harder than the right side. So the fibers in the heart are high in mitochondria and lots of blood vessels, and they use aerobic energy for contraction. So they're much more similar to a type 1 fiber than they are to a type 2 fiber in job. Right? So good. We're lucky that the heart is aerobic. Okay? Otherwise, how would we? It has to beat for a very long time. It starts somewhere around 4 weeks after conception, and hopefully it's still beating at 70. So it has to do a lot of work for a very, very long time. If it wasn't aerobic, how would it do that work? Right? If it was an anaerobic muscle, it wouldn't be able to do the job. So you don't have to learn that, because that's obvious, right? If the heart is going to be 65 times a minute for 71 years, is it aerobic or anaerobic? Right? So to me, if I'm studying, that's not something I have to learn, because that's kind of, if I put everything I know about aerobic and anaerobic together, then the heart has to be aerobic. Right? So that's one of those check, like I don't have to study that, because I already know enough to deduce that if I had to work it out for myself. There's only one kind of fiber. We don't have lots of different types of cardiac fibers. There's only one kind. So when I train, then the left side of the heart has to work even harder, because it's now got to get extra oxygen and extra nutrients via the blood to all those muscles that are working really hard while we're training. And so we see an increase in size in the left side of the heart, in the left ventricle. You also see an increase in the left side of the heart in someone who is hypertensive, who's diagnosed with high blood pressure. So if they are chronically hypertensive, that means the heart is having to work hard all the time, and that's kind of like giving it a training program. So it gets bigger, but the getting bigger is not healthy because it's because of the hypertension, not because of training. So an enlarged left ventricle, higher left ventricle mass, thicker left ventricle walls can be very positive if the history of this individual is they train hard. But it also can be diagnostic for someone who is hypertensive. Is it pathological adaptation? Is it training-driven adaptation? Okay, so ECGs are really a fascinating piece of information. And I would say as a PE teacher, as a coach, you don't have to know very much about ECG because that's not your job. You're not going to be looking at an ECG if you're a PE teacher or a coach. Even at a D1 school, coaches aren't looking at ECGs. A trainer may be able to at a D1 school. But they're really fascinating because at some point in your life, you're going to have an ECG. Right? When you're older, you will probably go and get an ECG because your doctor likes to have a baseline measure of what is healthy so that they can identify when things start to go wrong, and things start to go wrong. Right? So we have to have baseline measures. ECGs are really fascinating. They tell us tons and tons of information. So my P wave is atrial depolarization. Who remembers what depolarization is? We had depolarization last week and repolarization. What's the depolarization? If I depolarize a membrane, what does that allow me to do? Go for it, Matthew.
What's the question again?
If I depolarize the membrane, what does that allow me to do? What does depolarizing the membrane initiate? Oh, I'm not looking forward to grading these exams, guys. Right, if I depolarize the membrane then, I'm going to take the membrane to threshold and we're going to see an action potential initiated. So I have to depolarize the membrane in order to see the electrical signal move across the nerve or across the muscle. So if I'm depolarizing the atrium, this is when my atrium is contracting. So the top chamber is contracting and squeezing blood into the bottom chamber. Then I have a bit of a rest where the atria is repolarizing, and then I see ventricle depolarization. So here's my AV node hanging on to the signal for a minute amount of time. Atria contract, minute break, ventricle contracts. If I didn't have this break, then I wouldn't have anywhere for the blood to go during this contraction. Here's my great big spike for my ventricles, because they're much bigger. You look at any picture of the heart, right? There's much more mass down in the ventricle than there is up in the atria. So the spike is larger when I look at the ventricle contraction. And here we get ventricle repolarization, T wave. So this little segment here, to a cardiologist, is very interesting. Okay? Because when I do a stress test, so when you go in and you do your VO2 max test, then they're going to have electrodes on you and they're going to take an ECG at the same time. You might be interested in the VO2 max because that's an indicator of aerobic fitness and aerobic capacity, but your cardiologist is looking at what's happening with this pattern here. So if my ST segment is depressed, if it's down here and it's not on this kind of baseline, then that indicates that there's some damage to the heart. So just by looking at this little squiggle, someone who knows what they're reading can see changes in the typical pattern that indicate particular problems within the heart. Okay. And they would want, if you were doing your stress test, they might stop your stress test completely, or they might at least say, you know what, now we're looking at this ECG, we need to run further tests because we need to investigate why the ST segment is low. But so again, it depends how you learn. The ECG shows you how the heart contracts. Atria contract, ventricles contract, ventricle relax. Atria contract, ventricles contract, ventricles relax. The atria are also relaxing in here. If we had a 3D ECG, we would have a bump like this at the same time as this, but the atria bump gets lost because the ventricle depolarization is so big. So, atria, ventricles, ventricles relax. Atria, ventricles, ventricles relax. Atria, ventricles, ventricles relax. And it will go on. And it gets tighter and bigger depending how hard you're working. So I can also pick up high blood pressure on this if I know what I'm looking for. All right. So, heart's contracting. Kind of got that picture. Okay? We know how that's happening. We know what's controlling the heart contracting. And we know that that contraction means that there is blood moving in and out of the heart. So now we need to look at how much blood is moving in and out of the heart, because that drives how much exercise I can do. So cardiac output is also called Q. It's shortened to Q. All right? If it has a dot over it, it's per minute. Right? So Q, and I don't know why they pick Q, because it doesn't relate to cardiac output. It's a very old choice of symbol to me for cardiac output, but that's what it is. Right? So Q, cardiac output, is how much blood is pumped out of my heart per minute. So, how much blood comes out per minute? Well, how many times is my heart rate, how many times is my heart contracting? per minute. When we measure heart rate, we measure beats per minute. Beat is contraction. Right? So we could call heart rate 65 contractions per minute, but we use the term beat, but that's the same thing. So if I'm going to work out how much blood comes out per minute, I would have to know how many times the heart contracted per minute. And I would have to know how much blood comes out every time the heart contracts, which is called stroke volume, which far more conveniently is shortened to SB. So Q is the product of heart rate and stroke volume. How much blood pumped out per squish, per contraction, is stroke volume. How many times it contracts is heart rate, gives me how much blood per minute. When they measure stroke volume, then they use these two interim volumes, end diastolic and systolic. So, pretend the heart is a beaker. Okay. This is a ventricle. Diastolic, diastole, relaxation. Okay. So, how much blood is in the ventricle at the point when the ventricle has relaxed so that the blood can flow in? So, I pour in the water to my beaker. How much water do I have in the beaker? Okay. Then I squish the beaker, because it's going to be one of those little nice white plastic cups that I can squish. Right? I squish the beaker and a load of water flies out of the beaker. Right? How much water do I have left in the beaker at the end of the squish? Right? Systolic, end systolic volume, systole, contraction. How much blood is left in the ventricle at the end of contraction? Okay. So, then, this here is my stroke volume, right? How much blood did I have in there? Subtract how much blood I've got left. Tells me how much blood went out. It's not rocket science. Okay? But when we're exercising, when we're training, when we're looking for positive adaptation, this plays a big role. So I have to understand this. Question. Sure? All right, so we're going to finish off talking about stroke volume, and we'll pick up from there. Start looking at blood flow on Wednesday.